Hello, my puppets. Here I am with my Grimm's Fairy Tales, and I'm going to read to you again. Now that I have some wonderful air in my lungs, I'm going to tell you about the Elves. There once was a shoemaker, through no fault of his own, who became so poor that at last he had nothing left but just enough leather to make one pair of shoes. He cut out the shoes at night as to set upon work on them the next morning, and he had a good conscience, so lay himself quietly down in his bed and committed himself to heaven and fell asleep. In the morning, after he had said his prayers and was going to get to work, he found the pair of shoes made and finished and standing on his table. He was very much astonished and could not tell what to think, and he took the shoes in hand to examine them more closely, and they were so well made that every stitch was in the right place, just as if they had come from the hand of a master worksman. Soon after, a purchaser entered, and as the shoes fitted him very well, he gave more money than the usual price for them, so that the shoemaker had enough money to buy leather for 2 more pairs of shoes. He cut them out at night and intended to set upon work the next morning with a fresh spirit, but that was not to be, for when he got up they were already finished, and even a customer who was not lacking, he gave so much money that the shoemaker was able to buy enough leather for 4 new pairs. Early the next morning, he found out that the evening had been worked up just as before, and so he was very soon in the way of making a good living, and in the end became very well-to-do. One night, not long before Christmas, when the shoemaker had finished cutting out and before going to bed, he said to his wife, "How would it be if we sat up tonight to see who it is who does us this service?" His wife agreed and set to light a burn, and then they both hid in the corner of the room behind some coats that were hanging up, and they began to watch. As soon as it was midnight, they saw come in 2 neatly formed naked little men. They sat themselves before the shoemaker's table and took up to work that was already prepared and began to stitch and pierce and hammer so cleverly and quickly with their little fingers that the shoemaker's eyes could scarcely follow them, and so full of wonder was he that they never left off until everything was finished and standing ready on the table. And once the elves had finished, they jumped and ran off. The next morning, the shoemaker's wife said to her husband, "Those little men have made us rich, and we ought to show ourselves grateful. With all their running about and having nothing to cover them, it must be very cold. I'll tell you what, I will make little shirts and coats and waistcoats and breeches for them, and knit each pair of them a set of stockings, and you shall make them a pair of shoes." The husband consented willingly, and at night when everything was finished, they laid their gifts together on the table, and instead of the cut-out work, they had placed themselves so they could observe the little men and see how they would behave. Well, midnight came, and when the elves rushed in, ready to set to work, what they found instead of the prepared pieces of leather were the neat little garments put ready for them, and they stood a moment in surprise. Then they showed the greatest delight, and with great swiftness they took up the pretty garments and slipped them on, singing, "What spruce and dandy boys are we, no longer cobblers will we be." And they hopped and danced about, hopping and jumping all over the chairs and tables, until at last they danced right out the door. And from that time they were never seen again, but it always went well with the shoemaker as long as he lived, and whatever he took in hand prospered. So I love the little elves and the shoemaker, but it turns out there's a couple more elf stories to tell, as they've come in 3 little story sets. So the second is this. There was once a poor servant maid who was very cleanly and industrious. She swept down the house every day and put the sweepings on a great heap by the door. One morning, before she began her work, she found a letter, and as she could not read, she laid her broom in the corner and took the letter to her master and mistress to see what it was about. And it was an invitation from the elves, who wished the maid to come and stand godmother to one of their children. Well, the maid did not know what to do, and she was told that no one ought to refuse the elves anything, so she made up her mind to go. So there came 3 little elves who conducted her into the middle of a high mountain where the little people lived. And here everything was of small size, but more fine and elegant than could ever be told. The mother of the child lay in bed, made of ebony and studded with pearls, and the counterpane was embroidered with gold, and the cradle of ivory, and the bathtubing of gold. And so the mother was brought before, and the maid stood as godmother, and was ready for going home. But the elves begged her to stay at least 3 more days with them, and so she consented, and spent her time in mirth and jollity, and the elves seemed very fond of her. But at last, when she was ready to go away, they filled her pockets full of gold, and led her back out of the mountain. When she got back to the house, she was going to begin working again, and took up her broom in hand, and was still standing in the corner where she had left it, and so she began to sweep. And then come some strangers, and asked who she was, and what she was doing. And she had found that instead of 3 days, she had been 7 years with the elves in the mountains, and during that time, her master and mistress had died. So that's kind of sad that, she just went on a quick little adventure, and suddenly time just whisks away like that. But, I've been caught in a fairy trap fairly similar, I think. And it's easy to see that time disappearing. Well, here's our last story. The elves once took a child away from its mother and left a changeling with a big head and staring eyes who did nothing but eat and drink. Which kind of sounds like an ordinary baby anyway, but never mind. The mother, in her trouble, went to her neighbors and asked their advice. Their neighbors told her to take the changeling into the kitchen and put it near the hearth, and then to make up a fire and boil water in 2 eggshells, and that would make the changeling laugh, and if he laughed, he would be all over with him. And so the woman did as her neighbors advised, and when she set the eggshells of water on the fire, the changeling said, "Though old I be, as forest and tree, cooking an eggshell I never did see," and began to laugh. And directly there came a crowd of elves, bringing the right child, and laid it near the hearth, and carried the changeling away with them. So, there we have the stories of the elves, and just finding out what kind of antics they can get up to, and how humans can get kind of lost about in their path. But hopefully all turns out well.